Hey guys, Eric from Whorticulture, and today we're going to look at the mix for Cut Myself. So let's dig in. So we're going to look at, the first thing we're going to look at is the vocals, and where we came from and how we got here. So here's the vocals by themselves of where we are.
I'm wide awake, floating away. This muted dream is where I stay.
Okay, so that's the verse. A lot going on. Very pretty, clear. Here's where we came from. Here's where we came from.
I'm wide awake, floating away. This muted dream is where I...
So obviously we have our work cut out for us with making these all pretty and gussying them up. So the first thing that we do, if you saw in some of the other videos, is we have our main Vox bus. And this kind of changes from time to time, but on this one particular one, we have some tape. So it mimics some of the properties of a tape machine and hitting tape. And then from there, we're going to an SSL compressor and decapitator, which is kind of another tape processor to make things sound thicker and there's more harmonic content. And then we go down from there. So first plug-in we have is lo-fi, which makes things, we add a little bit of distortion into it, just a little tiny bit. And in this case, I used a sample rate decrease. What that does is it just makes things sound a little bit more gritty and gives it some character. Next thing is a de-esser. That takes all that out so we can really push the high end and make things sound pretty. And then the next thing we're going to do is we hit this with this EQ here. Basically what this EQ is doing is it's taking like these nasty frequencies out that we don't want in our vocal chain. So basically what that sounds like on its own. It's this ghosty, nasty frequency by itself. Let me see if I can.
This muted dream is where I
So we're taking that out. We don't need that in our vocal chain.
Dream is where I...
Next thing we're doing is we're hitting things through kind of an analog, virtual analog console. And we're boosting the high end a little bit, boosting a little bit of that presence, taking down some of the low end boxiness. And we're just barely hitting the compressor. It looks like I wasn't actually hitting the compressor as hard on this. Then our first compressor chain is going to be 1176. If you've seen any of the vocals that I do, I always use the blue stripe 1176 for compression and just hammering it.
Dream is where I stay.
Without it,
this muted dream is where I...
So basically what it's doing is it's taking the sound of the vocals and it's like just bringing them up, like in your face. Okay? Next thing we're going to hit is another compressor, but this one's kind of doing a limiter. So we do heavy compression and then a limiting effect, which is going to squash the peaks even more. But what the effect that does is it's a slower attack. That means it starts compressing at a slower rate than you would the first compressor we used, 1176. And what that's going to do is it's going to squash everything and just keep it really, really, really level. Then the next thing we're going to hit is a multi-band compressor. So what this does is any frequency band that like is kind of out of control, what this does is it tames it, but it does it all independently. So with that,
This muted dream is where I stay.
so we're really hitting this band right here, which is in the 1 through 12K, and all it is just hitting that, and the low end, low mids are what we're really dealing with.
Muted dream is where I.
So after that, we're hitting it with another EQ, but this one's special. What it does is it finds all the individual resonances in a vocal, and it just brings those down, so you smooth out even more.
This muted dream is where I.
So all those little dips right there is what the EQ is essentially dynamically taking out, so it doesn't affect the sound the entire time that he's singing. Next thing after that, another multiband. I know it's crazy, but this time I had to take out even more of these resonances that I was hearing. In this case,
dream is where
there's a little bit too much. Okay, and then also there's a little bit of this. So we're taking that out, and we're finishing off those vocals with another tape plugin. This, again, tape is like one of those things where it saturates things and adds harmonics that you wouldn't usually hear, and what that does is it thickens things up and almost pulls the sound out of the speakers into your forehead almost, and that's what we're trying to do. The next thing we want to do is add some reverb. Vocal reverb is, very important. Where did I put the reverb?
it's
Right here. So reverb is dark plate. This is not a very long plate, and a plate pretty much is just a long sheet of metal that signal gets passed through, and it gives it a really washy reverb sound. Very very smooth, not very fast transient response. So it's really good for vocals. So plates are very, very good for vocals. In this case, doing a dark one. And then we do after that is we're going to hit things with another delay, but this delay is a quarter note. So with
It's all I've known. I reap the emptiness I've sown.
So the delay is just giving that space and etherealness. And then the next plugin that we'll put on there is a chorus. And the chorus that we're going to be using for this one is, I call it goth chorus, but that's not particularly goth. It's just what I called it. But in this case, it's a guitar pedal, CE2 guitar pedal, and we're passing that through another EQ, and then a little bit of that Vox verb that we're going to feed that in, and that gives it width and depth.
It's all I've known. I reap the
By itself,
emptiness I've sown. And I forget that there is something.
but we just want a little bit of that, and then you ended up the whole vocal effects chain with a automating eighth note delay, and this is just on certain words that will automate that delay. And that's pretty much the lead vocal. As you can see, all the chorus vocals get some, pretty much that exact same chain, and same exact effects. So delay, 2 delays, Vox reverb, and chorus. Yep, and you'll see that throughout all of the main vocals. So that's our lead vocal chain. It's time for drums! So here is kind of what the kick drum sounded like before we got to it. It's kind of mid-rangey. That means there's not a lot of top-end definition, and there's not a ton of low-end like thump and sub-moving material down there. So the first thing we got to do is throw our EQ on, and in this case we're boosting a bunch of that high end, see, and also some of that presence, that attack, the sound. We want that to come out a little bit more. All of a sudden you're starting to feel the definition. Then we go to this next EQ, and we're going to add some of these areas where we want to highlight the thumpiness. In this case, it's about 100 hertz and 400 hertz and 95 hertz. So that's going to add a little bit more thumpy chestiness. And then I'm going to add some more low end with the Pultec. This is like a tube equalizer. And then the next thing in there. And this one's kind of extreme, but I wanted to find exactly where the fundamental of that kick drum was happening. In this case, I took a frequency and boosted this frequency quite a bit. That's going to give the definition. And this works really good with kicks because they're consistent, right? So there's not a lot of low-end information that's moving around. It's not like a bass note that's changing fundamental as you're playing. This is constant. So this kick, we're just finding that low-end energy. In this case, it's right here. Next thing we're doing, we're hitting things with the API, and this is another EQ that we're taking out some of the mid-ranginess, and we're also, I think we were clipping things, so I took down the overall output. There's before. See, it's kind of like, almost sounds, I kind of describe it as like paper bag kick, and there's something about, I don't know why I visualize paper bag, but when I hear something in a kick drum that feels like paper bag, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna need to do something to that. So this unpaper bags it, and a lot of that is adding the top end clarity. This particular processor is really famous for drums, a lot of things, but we're adding very tippy top of that EQ range, and then taking out a little bit more of that 500, which is the mid-range honkiness in drums, especially kick drums. You know, if we're a metal bands, if they'll use this trick of taking the mid-range, the 500, completely out of kick drums, so it's very clicky and oomphy. So we're kind of using that same concept. And then the last but not least part of the kick drum is going to be, this is really cool. So what we're doing is we're just highlighting certain frequencies that we want more attack to come out of the kick drum. Okay? In this case, I wanted it to be on the 4K. So I wanted more attack, like a faster transient, to get through the mix at a specific frequency. In this case, it's 4K. Without it, it's very subtle, but in the context of the mix, it really brings out the attackiness of it. Next thing, and this is kind of an interesting one for us, is the snare drum. So, original concept of the snare, I was thinking like, you know, very fast, almost 90s style claps and snare drum. And 90s drums are, and instruments and vocals in the 90s is for more or less very dry. There's not a lot of effects in there, not a ton of distortion. So that was a kind of concept that I was like visualizing in my head. So the snares, pretty much the only thing that's on the snare is a little bit of chorus and a little bit of reverb. So, and we layered those. So the first snare is this. So that's the first sample. Next thing is claps, and I think we use for these, oh yeah, TR-707 claps. So that's an old drum machine from Roland using those claps. Okay, and then we have a low snare, and then a clap offset, which is like time aligned wideners. Fed all those through an EVQ, a little bit of Abbey Road's distortion, and then again that API, getting a little bit of that top end to get it to get through. Transient designer, we want more sustain out of the claps. Even though they're quick, they were a little too quick. So I'm adding more length to the actual clap sound, and then hitting it with a little bit more distortion. And this is very subtle distortion. It's not like this is quick, clean distortion, and then another multiband compressor. And mostly I'm just using it to just tame the top end a little bit, but also hitting some of those frequencies of the clap that are a little bit more accentuated. And then you send that through with reverb. Very short reverb. In this case, it's a 1 second reverb. Very quick room. And then we wanted a little bit more reverb in the context of the mix. So added a chamber. From this company, it's Valhalla, and they make amazing plugins. Check them out. They're actually really non-expensive. It's like $50 for a reverb. Yep. Then we move down. We've got hats. This one's interesting because like there's multiple hi-hats in this, and multiple ways we're using them. So the first hat is, you notice how they're panned a little bit to the left in here. This beat is my recital. So we have those by themselves. Let me get them. A little bit of room reverb on there, and we're also EQing them, getting a lot of the high end to come through. On those hi-hats, we're using a delay, and to get the groove going with the delay, I'm also using a sidechain. So it's sidechaining a little bit of those hi-hats. Here's a little bit more pronounced. So it's like almost like an offbeat feel. And then sending that through, in this case, a reverb. Next thing is some of those other hi-hats. So these ones are completely on the other side, and they're doing okay, hitting those with EQ. Again, a little bit of delay. Also, same trick, just a little tiny bit of sidechain. so that we can get this like kind of nice hi-hat groove going. And here it is in the chorus. And then obviously doing some reverb in there. And then we did add some 909 hats in the chorus that are just doing, I believe, just offbeats here. All together. And then, because side chaining these a lot more, these 909s, is it makes it feel like almost like a person would play it, i.e. me, or whoever. And that's like pretty much for the drums. They all go through my drum bus, which is kind of morphed over time, but kind of the same thing. API, we're just doing a little bit of top end, a little bit of bottom end, using this analog tube mojo machine, I want to call it. Add saturation to things. It makes it sound, saturation is cool because it makes things sound louder than they actually are peaking on your meters. So it just makes everything sound fuller without you having to turn up the volume. We're using that into more compressors. In this case, I'm just using 2 of them. And then another EQ, and this is a cool EQ. What it does is it's another tube based off a tube equalizer, and we're just hitting the top end, a little bit of bottom end, and that's about it. We're leaving the mid range alone, and then bus compressor. We're only hitting. Notice how we're using compression. We're not hit. Nothing is like ever, especially with drums. We're not killing it. This is only like a little bit. Look at that meter move, just that much. And then this is another SSL. And all this is using is a little bit of the drive, a little bit of the treble and bass, and all I'm doing is using this as kind of like a finalizer for the drums. And then I send it through a louder bus, which is interesting, but it's an expander. So what I'm doing is the high level things, like high level transients, I'm limiting those, but I'm taking all the low level things that are quiet and bringing them up. So that's what this does. And basically it squashes the whole signal to like this little tiny, there's not a lot of dynamics. And what that does is it sometimes can make everything sound way louder than it actually is. And then these other drum crush is like distortion. So it's pretty much just drum bus, louder, call it good. Again, not a ton of reverb. Everything sounds pretty tight and dry. And that's the way we frickin' like it. Actually, we don't. We like things wet and expansive. All right, so that was a look into the mix for Cut Myself. Hopefully you guys got something out of it. We had a great time mixing it, and hopefully we'll see you around for the next one.